The old oak tree at the edge of Jake Mitchell's farm had stood for over a century, its roots deep in the land his family had worked for generations. As a boy, he had sat beneath its sprawling branches, listening to his grandfather's stories of hardship and triumph, of floods and droughts, of neighbors who lent a hand and those who tried to take more than their share. But never in his life had he faced an enemy quite like this. A woman who didn't wield storms or failing crops, but power in the form of bureaucracy, arrogance, and sheer, relentless entitlement. Today, that enemy was marching up his gravel driveway in pristine beige heels, clipboard in hand, and the determination of a woman who had spent her life controlling everything and everyone around her. She wasn't here for a friendly chat. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, leaning against the railing of his porch as he watched the approaching storm. Karen Whitmore, self-proclaimed queen of the Crestwood Estates Homeowners Association, had set her sights on his farm, and if the previous letters and complaints were any indication, today was just the next act in her ridiculous crusade. "Mr. Mitchell," she called out as she reached the porch steps, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "I'd like to have a word about your property." Jake exhaled through his nose, setting his mug down. "Funny, I wasn't looking to have a word about mine." Karen's smile tightened, but she pressed on. "You may not be part of our community, but your farm borders Crestwood Estates, and we have certain expectations for maintaining the aesthetic integrity of our neighborhood. We've received multiple complaints from residents about." Jake held up a hand. "Let me guess. The barn? The rooster? The fact that my land doesn't look like one of your manicured little postage stamp yards." Karen's eyes flickered with something close to irritation, but she remained composed. "The red barn is quite an eyesore. A neutral color would blend better with the neighborhood. The noise from your animals is disruptive. And frankly, some of our residents find the general look of your property." She gestured vaguely at the wide expanse of golden fields, the towering silos, the grazing cattle, unsuitable for the community. Jake let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Lady, this farm has been here for over 100 years. Your community has been here for 5. I'd say it's your HOA that doesn't belong." Karen's expression darkened. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand that change can be difficult, but this is really in everyone's best interest. A harmonious neighborhood requires cooperation. I'd hate for this to become a more complicated issue." Jake tilted his head. "That a threat?" "Of course not." She smiled, but her voice dripped with condescension. "I'm simply suggesting we work together before this has to involve county officials." That was the moment Jake knew she wouldn't stop. He had seen this type before. People who mistook politeness for weakness, who assumed that because he lived a simple life, he could be pushed around. He took a slow step forward, fixing her with the same steady gaze he used on stubborn cattle. "Miss Whitmore, let me make something clear. This land doesn't fall under your little HOA. You don't get a say in what color I paint my barn, what animals I keep, or how I run my farm. If you don't like the smell of fresh air or the sound of a rooster doing what roosters do, that's not my problem." Karen's nostrils flared, but she kept her voice level. "We'll see about that." And with that, she turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV, her clipboard clutched tight in her manicured hands. Jake watched her go, shaking his head. He had dealt with floods, droughts, and the occasional ornery bull. But something told him Karen was about to be the most stubborn beast he'd ever had to wrangle. Jake should have known Karen wasn't the kind of woman to take no for an answer. She wasn't just a pest. She was a storm in high heels, brewing trouble with every step. And sure enough, the first warning shot came 2 days later, tucked into his mailbox like a venomous snake waiting to strike. A formal letter. HOA letterhead. Official-sounding nonsense about community standards and visual harmony, as if a farm that had existed for generations was suddenly an eyesore just because a bunch of suburbanites decided they wanted a picture-perfect view. Jake smirked, crumpling the letter in his hand before tossing it into the kitchen trash. "Nice try, Karen, But that was just the beginning. The next morning, a white county truck rolled up his driveway. Two men stepped out, clipboards in hand, looking around like they expected to find toxic waste instead of cows and hay. Jake, who had been repairing a fence post near the barn, straightened up and walked over, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Morning, gentlemen. Something I can help you with." The older of the two, a man named Roger, who Jake recognized from the county zoning office, sighed. "Look, Jake, I'm just going to level with you. We got a bunch of complaints about your farm. Zoning violations, health hazards, animal welfare concerns." He looked around. "Obviously, I don't see a damn thing wrong here." Jake crossed his arms. "Let me guess. All the complaints came from Crestwood Estates." Roger rubbed his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Yeah, same name on most of them. Karen Whitmore." Jake let out a low chuckle. "That woman really thinks she can harass me off my own land." Roger shrugged. "I don't like it any more than you do, but I gotta do my job. Just a routine check. We'll be in and out." True to his word, the inspection was quick. The pens were clean, the animals were well cared for, and the zoning regulations hadn't changed in over 50 years. Karen had nothing, but that didn't stop her. The next day, a different complaint. This time, it was noise violations. Jake was out feeding the goats when his phone rang. Local sheriff's department. "Jake, Sheriff Tom Caldwell's familiar voice came over the line. I got a noise complaint from your address." Jake snorted. "Let me guess. The rooster." "You got it." Tom sighed. "Says it's crowing too early and disrupting the neighborhood." Jake stared at the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were barely peeking over the fields. It was a dam farm. Roosters crowed. That's what they did. "Tom, you ever hear of a rooster that sleeps in?" "Nope." "Then I guess there's no problem, is there?" Tom chuckled. "Nope. Just figured I'd give you a heads up. If she keeps filing these bogus complaints, I'll be having a talk with her." But Karen wasn't the kind of woman to be deterred by common sense. A few days later, the real escalation came. Jake was hauling a fresh bale of hay when he noticed two men in suits standing near his property line, looking over a set of blueprints. He wiped his hands on his jeans and strode over, feeling a familiar knot of irritation tighten in his chest. "What's going on here?" One of the men, a wiry guy with thick glasses, adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm with the County Property Division. We've received an inquiry regarding the boundary lines of your farm." Jake's jaw clenched. "An inquiry from who?" The man hesitated. "The Crestwood Estates HOA." Jake let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "And what exactly are they claiming?" "That your property line may have been drawn incorrectly, and that a portion of your land technically falls within their jurisdiction." Jake laughed. Actually laughed. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all week." He gestured to his fence, to the deed that had been in his family for over a century. "This land's been marked the same way for generations. There's no may about it." The second man, younger and clearly less comfortable, cleared his throat. Yes. Well, we'll be reviewing the original survey maps to verify. If everything checks out, there's nothing to worry about." Jake stepped closer, lowering his voice. "And if it doesn't check out?" The first man adjusted his tie again. "Then there may be a case for reassessment." Jake's fists curled at his sides. Karen wasn't just trying to fine him. She was trying to steal his damn land. He forced a smile. "You go ahead and check those maps. But I'll save you some trouble. I have copies of my land deed. And if anyone from the HOA so much as sets foot on my property again, they'll be facing trespassing charges." The younger guy swallowed. The older one just nodded stiffly before turning away. That night, Jake went inside, dug through his filing cabinet, and pulled out every document related to his farm. Deeds, zoning permits, property surveys. He made copies and put them in a folder by the front door. Karen wanted to play dirty. Fine. But she had no idea who she was messing with. Jake wasn't one for petty fights, but he knew when to dig in his heels. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one. The difference? He played by the rules, and he played to win. The morning after the so-called property review, Jake paid a visit to the county records office. He walked in, set his folder down in front of the clerk, and with the calm authority of a man who knew his land better than he knew the back of his hand, said, "I need official copies of every record tied to Mitchell Farm. Deed history, property line surveys, agricultural zoning confirmations, the works." The clerk, a friendly older woman named Marcy, gave him a knowing look. "This about that HOA nonsense?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Word travels fast." Marcy huffed. "Hon, you're not the first one they've tried this with. They pulled a similar stunt a few years back. Tried to annex a little mom-and-pop nursery just because they didn't like the unruly trees. The county shut that down real quick." She slid the documents across the counter. "Here you go. If they try anything, you've got ironclad proof they're full of it." Jake nodded, tipping his hat. "Appreciate it, Marcy." That afternoon, while Jake was reinforcing his fence, just in case, he spotted movement near the property line. Karen, she was standing there with two other HOA board members, whispering and pointing at his land like she was strategizing a military invasion. He could already picture what she'd try next. If she couldn't take his land outright, she'd find another angle to make his life miserable. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and strode over, a slow smirk tugging at his lips. "Something I can help you with." Karen turned, flashing her usual tight-lipped smile. "Ah, Mr. Mitchell. Just taking a look at the, boundary situation." Jake crossed his arms. "You mean the boundary you have zero claim over? The one that's been confirmed by county records?" Karen's eye twitched, but she kept her composure. "We're simply reviewing options. Some of our residents have expressed concern over the appearance of the farm. We believe a privacy fence would be beneficial." Jake glanced at the two HOA members behind her. One of them, a lanky man in an overpriced polo, avoided his gaze, while the other, a short woman with an air of forced authority, stiffened. "So let me get this straight," Jake drawled. "You want to build a fence to block the view of my farm? On my land?" Karen smiled, but it was forced. For the good of the community, Jake chuckled, slow and deliberate. "Tell you what, you put up a fence on your side of the line? Go right ahead. But step 1 inch onto my property, and I'll have the sheriff down here, so fast your clipboard will catch fire." Karen's smile dropped. "There's no need for hostility." "No hostility here," Jake said, leaning on the fence post. "Just a man protecting what's his." Karen's expression hardened. "This isn't over." Jake shrugged. Didn't think it was, and sure enough, it wasn't. The next morning, Jake woke up to the sound of a chainsaw. His stomach dropped. He threw on his boots, rushed outside, and what he saw made his blood boil. A work crew, on his land, cutting through a section of his property line. Karen stood a few feet away, arms crossed, nodding approvingly. Jake stormed over. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen turned with mock innocence. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell, just making some improvements. This fence will ensure a more harmonious relationship between our properties." Jake's jaw clenched. "That fence is on my land." Karen tilted her head. "That's debatable." Jake let out a slow, dangerous breath. "Do these men have a permit for this?" One of the workers, a burly guy with a nervous look, hesitated before muttering. The HOA said they had all the legal paperwork. Jake smirked. "Yeah? Well, they don't." He pulled out his phone and, without breaking eye contact with Karen, started dialing. Karen's expression flickered for the first time. "What are you doing?" "Calling the sheriff." A tense silence stretched between them. The work crew exchanged glances. Karen huffed. "There's no need to involve the authorities." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Then you'd best tell your people to pack it up. Because if they cut 1 more inch into my land, they're trespassing, and I'll press charges." Karen glared at him, her jaw tight. But she knew she'd lost this round. With a sharp wave of her hand, she barked at the workers. "Stop. We're done here." They shut off the chainsaws, packed up their tools, drove off. Jake stood there, arms crossed, watching Karen seethe. "This isn't over," she snapped before storming off. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. She was right. It wasn't over. But neither was he. Jake knew Karen wasn't done. People like her didn't back down. They doubled down. She had tried legal loopholes, intimidation, even outright trespassing. None of it worked. Now, she was going to get desperate. And desperate people made mistakes. The next morning, Jake was hauling hay bales to the barn when he noticed something new at the edge of his property. A for sale sign. He stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing. The sign was positioned right by the road, making it look like his farm was up for sale. Beneath the large, bold lettering, a smaller sign read, "Under negotiation, coming soon, Crestwood Estates expansion." Jake laughed, a low, disbelieving chuckle that turned into a full-bodied, "This woman has lost her damn mind" kind of laugh. Still shaking his head, he grabbed his phone and took a picture of the sign. Then he walked straight over, yanked it out of the ground, and carried it back to his porch like a trophy. Before he could even dial the county office, he heard the sharp, clipped footsteps of none other than Karen Whitmore marching up his driveway. He turned just in time to see her forced, plastic smile. "Oh, Mr. Mitchell," she said, feigning surprise. "I see you found the sign. There's been a little mix-up, but I'm sure we can clear it up quickly." Jake leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "A mix-up?" Karen nodded, her tone syrupy sweet. "You see, we at the HOA have been in discussions about acquiring nearby properties for future expansion. Some overzealous realtors assumed your farm was included." Jake arched an eyebrow. "You expect me to believe a real estate agency just accidentally listed my land?" Karen's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. There was some enthusiasm about the prospect. Jake let out a slow breath. "Karen, I'll say this once. You do not own my land. You do not make decisions about my property. And if I see another sign like this, I won't be tearing it down. I'll be suing your entire HOA for fraud." Karen's nostrils flared. "Now, Mr. Mitchell, let's not be hasty." Jake pulled out his phone. "I can also get the county involved. Want to explain to them how you tried to fake sell someone else's land." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She turned sharply and stormed off, muttering under her breath. That should have been the final straw. But Karen was Karen. Jake had barely settled back into his routine when he started noticing strange cars parked near the road. At first, he thought it was just nosy HOA members. Then he saw the drone. It hovered over his barn one evening, just as the sun was setting. Jake narrowed his eyes. "Oh, hell no." He grabbed his phone and called the sheriff. "Tom," he said as soon as the line picked up. "You busy?" "Depends." "This about hers?" "Yep." "Talk to me." Jake explained the situation, his voice level but firm. The bogus complaints, the trespassing, the fake property claims, and now the surveillance. The sheriff let out a low whistle. "She hired a private investigator." Jake smirked. "Looks that way." "Well," Tom said, "I'd say it's time we had a real legal conversation with her." The next evening, Karen got a visit from the sheriff's department. Jake didn't know exactly what was said, but he knew this. Karen hated being confronted by authority. The next morning, her car was gone from her driveway, and for the first time in weeks, Crestwood Estates was silent. By the end of the week, something even better happened. Linda Matthews, a former HOA board member who had never quite agreed with Karen's reign of terror, showed up at Jake's farm with a smirk and a fresh-baked apple pie. "You're going to love this," she said, handing him the pie. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What am I about to love?" Linda grinned. "Karen, she's done." The board called an emergency meeting. The vote was unanimous. "She's out." Jake let out a low whistle. "No kidding." "Oh," It gets better, Linda said. Word is, she's selling her house. Jake took a slow bite of pie, letting the satisfaction settle in. That right? Yep. Rumor has it. She's moving to another HOA-run neighborhood across town. Linda snorted. Can you imagine? She's about to get a taste of her own rules. Jake grinned. Poetic justice. A week later, Karen's house officially went on the market. 2 weeks after that, she was gone. And just like that, peace returned to Crestwood Estates. Jake didn't throw a victory party. He didn't need to. Instead, he got a brand new sign made and planted it right at the edge of his land. It read, Mitchell Farms, HOA free since 1923. Within days, it became a local landmark. And as Jake sat on his porch, sipping his morning coffee, listening to his roosters crow, he couldn't help but smile. Karen had started this war, but he had finished it.